All right, yeah! Thank God for fantasy football. I'm Buster Brown, and the show is called Redemption Rehab. Today, we're taking a look at must-have players on the weekly waiver wire report for Week 10 of the NFL season, starting with this guy, wide receiver Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers. He's owned in about 15% of fantasy football leagues. He's been hurt for the last few weeks, but when he came back against the Cleveland Browns, he had 4 catches for 118 yards and a touchdown on 5 targets. You better be careful with this guy because he's got a lot of competition on his own team with Ladd McConkey, Joshua Palmer, and a veteran DJ Chark is coming back into the mix. So I can't suggest you pay a lot of money for him, but he had a breakout game, so a lot of people are going after him. Who else do we like? A guy we've been talking about for weeks. You could have got cheap, man. This is this guy, Mike Gesicki of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's a tight end. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 5 catches for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns on 6 targets. This guy's getting playing time because T. Higgins is out. When T. Higgins comes back, those numbers won't be so good for Mr. Gesicki. We've been talking about these two guys all year, man. That's why you got to hit that subscribe button. Who else have we been talking about all year? How about this guy, Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns? He's owned in over 50% of fantasy football leagues. He's a wide receiver. Again, last week he had 6 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown on 11 targets. Other guys on Cleveland like Jerry Jeudy and Elijah Moore, these are guys you might want to consider picking up too after they traded Amari Cooper to Buffalo. Who else do we like? Got to get this guy, man. How about Demario Douglas over in New England? He's a wide receiver only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. Last week against Tennessee, he had 7 catches for 35 yards on 9 targets. Another guy we talked about last week was Parker Washington of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's a wide receiver. We told you he'd be decent. He only had 3 catches for 41 yards on 6 targets, but he might be the go-to guy now that Christian Kirk is out for the season and Brian Thomas is nursing injuries. We've been talking for weeks about Xavier Leggett. He had another touchdown for the Carolina Panthers at wide receiver. He's still only owned in 25% of fantasy football leagues. Last week, he had 4 catches for 33 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets. Now that they've traded Deontay Johnson, Adam Thielen coming back, even though he's been hurt, you know, this guy might step up to the plate and start getting better. So I would tell you what, Xavier Leggett is someone you need to have on your roster. Other guys we really like, keep an eye on your radar for Jalen Coker of the Carolina Panthers. We also think you should have on your bench Jalen McMillan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's hurt right now, but he's only owned in 35% of fantasy football leagues. We talked about Elijah Moore for Cleveland, who's still only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. And we've been telling you for weeks about Ricky Pearsall, wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. He's owned in 30% of fantasy football leagues. He should do well without Brandon Ayuk there gone for this season. And a guy we've been talking about for weeks, we keep saying, go out and get yourself some Demarcus Robinson out there and a wide receiver for the Los Angeles Rams because Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp have been nursing injuries. And this guy had 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. And we keep telling you about him. Hit that subscribe button. What did he do last week? Well, he had 6 catches for 94 yards and 2 TDs on 9 targets because Puka Nacua got thrown out of the game first quarter. Who else do we like? Well, how about Noah Brown down there in Washington? We've been talking about him for weeks. He's led the team in receiving last week. He had 5 catches for 60 yards on 6 targets. And with the injury down there at Drake London in Atlanta, this wide receiver, Ray McLeod, had 3 catches for 28 yards and a touchdown. So I look for him to pick it up next week without Drake London in the lineup. And you can't forget about a guy we haven't talked about all year. How about Nick Westbrook Icon down there in Tennessee? When they traded DeAndre Hopkins to Kansas City, this guy took over and he had 5 catches for 30 yards and another touchdown for 3 weeks in a row. So make sure you go down and get this guy. Tell you what, we got some running backs you got to know about. It's almost playoff time in fantasy football. You got about 4 or 5 weeks before you got to get your backup handcuffed running backs. starting with this guy. Everybody's going out and picking up Isaac Guerrero, San Francisco. He's only owned in 17% of fantasy football leagues. He's the handcuff to Christian McCaffrey, who should be back in Week 10, and Mason, who's nursing a injured shoulder. You got to get Ray Davis for the Buffalo Bills also. He's only owned in 20% of fantasy football leagues. He's handcuffed to James Cook. Last week, Ray Davis had 4 carries for 20 yards, but he caught 2 balls for 70 yards and a touchdown. And you got to start getting your handcuffs to players like James Conner. And I'll tell you what, man, DeAndre Swift gets banged up every year. You better have yourself as a handcuff Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues. And now that the Cincinnati Bengals lost Mason for the year, they traded for Khalil Herbert of the Chicago Bears. So I look for Khalil Herbert to be, Chase Brown's handcuff. So go out and get yourself some Khalil Herbert. He got traded today. Who else do we like? Well, we talked about Mike Gesicki at tight end. There are other tight ends we like. We've been talking about these guys all year, like Taysom Hill of the New Orleans Saints. He had another great game last week. He's only owned in 35% of fantasy football leagues. He ran the ball 5 times for 19 yards and a touchdown. He also caught 4 passes for 41 yards. And he didn't throw any passes last week, but he has in the past 4 touchdowns. Guys like a Swiss Army knife. He's on your waiver wire. Go out and get him, put him in your lineup. Here's some other tight ends we really like. How about Jonnu Smith down here in Miami? We've only talked about him half a dozen times this year. He's owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. He had another 5 catch for 46-yard performance on 6 targets. And you got to keep an eye on these guys for your radar. Jatavion Sanders down there in Carolina is a rookie we talked about in our NFL Draft Preview show. A guy we really like. He had a good week. And if Grant Calcaterra over there in Philadelphia is available, I'd go ahead and pick him up if Dallas Goedert isn't back from injury. Who else we like at quarterback? I'll tell you what, man. Go out and get yourself some Russell Wilson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Russell Wilson was on bye last week. He's only owned in 15% of fantasy football leagues, but he plays the Washington Commanders, and then he plays Baltimore, who's banged up in the secondary, even though they made a trade today for a good cornerback. Other guys we like, hey, man, it's late in the season. Dak Prescott's hurt. You might have to go out and get yourself some Daniel Jones of the New York Giants at Carolina in Germany this week. Last week, Daniel Jones was 20 of 26, 174 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He had a QBR of 119. I doubt Bo Nix is on your waiver wire, but if he is, go get him. And you might have to pick up Drake May of the New England Patriots. He's only owned in 10% of fantasy football leagues. He plays Chicago, the Rams, and Miami in that order in the next few weeks. He's a rookie we talked about in our NFL Draft Preview shows, which you can look at a link in the description. I'll tell you what, you need a good defense? How about these guys? Why not the New York Giants in Germany versus the Carolina Panthers? I'd be going out and picking up those guys. If you need a good kicker, hey, Chris Boswell, the Pittsburgh Steelers, was on bye last week. Maybe he got cut. I'd go get him. And Carlos Santos of the Chicago Bears. He does kick in Chicago, so he may only be good for a few weeks before the weather gets bad. When that happens, go out and get yourself some dome kickers like we've been talking about here on Fantasy Football Redemption Rehab. I'll tell you what, that's it for the Week 10 Weekly Waiver Wire Report. I'm Buster Brown. The show is called Redemption Rehab. Good luck.